Judges, this is team number 799. So at this time, if you'll let me know when you're ready, I will start the timer.
Welcome, we're Team 799, and let's begin by understanding the current and future economic outlook. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the United States debt will reach 185% of the nation's GDP by 2052. This is a concern because a high debt to GDP ratio is more unstable. For example, in the event of an economic crisis, a high debt to GDP ratio may limit the fiscal space available to engage in expansionary policy, and concerns as to whether or not the United States can pay back their debt can lead to higher borrowing costs and increase the likelihood of a default. Recently, the United States has reached its debt ceiling and is predicted to default by the end of the summer if action is not taken. Recent interest rate hikes have shown that the United States cannot always take on debt sustainably. And although some prominent economists believe that the real growth rate is greater than the long-run interest rate, we believe that it is best to be cautious about expanding the debt to GDP ratio because of Fed's recent actions against inflation.
Our proposed set of policies lead to a drastic reduction in the national debt, resulting in an estimated debt to GDP ratio of 87% in 2053. We set our target debt to GDP ratio at this lower goal to ensure the U.S. would have room to engage in additional borrowing if there are unforeseen negative economic shocks. And if you direct your attention to the bottom of the screen, you will see our debt to GDP thermometer. We will be using this metric to visualize the incremental effects of our policies on the debt to GDP ratio.
To prevent the challenges associated with a rising debt to GDP ratio and ensure a strong economic future for our nation, we propose the Rushmore Plan. We believe that in order to create a strong fiscal austerity, that we need to embody the traits of our most preeminent leaders. We need to create a strong foundation in the similar way that Washington created a mooring to which the entire nation could rest upon. We need to seize opportunity and be proactive in the same way President Jefferson was during the Louisiana Purchase. We need to reform what is difficult, just like President Lincoln. And finally, we need to be better stewards for our planet, just like President Roosevelt was when he enacted the National Park Service. Together, moorings, opportunity, reform, and environmentalism will create more for America.
First, we will look at a set of policies that reinforce the foundation of our nation by investing in education, strengthening the workforce through immigration, and reevaluating the defense budget.
Recent losses to the labor market and decreased fertility rates in the United States necessitate an expansion in our immigration. We propose to increase immigration to 1.8 million immigrants per year. Of this cohort, 1.2 million will be given permanent visas, whereas an additional 600,000 will be given temporary visas for temporary workers and students. Together, these policies will not only boost our productivity, but they will also lead to increased net tax receipts, ultimately resulting in a 12 percentage point decrease in our debt to GDP ratio in 2050.
We augment our immigration policy by creating a pathway to citizenship for those immigrants already living in the United States. Currently, according to the Migration Policy Institute, there are over 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States. We would offer citizenship to citizens eligible under the American Dream and Promise Act and essential workers. To qualify for this status, they must have lived in the United States for 5 years and complete one of the following: 2 years of study toward an advanced degree or technical training, 2 years of military service, or 3 years of work, 75% of which must be work authorized. Through these policies, this would free around 6 million immigrants from the burdens of being undocumented and give them access to markets which they previously were not available to them. This increase in productivity would bring down the debt to GDP ratio by 6 percentage points.
Another way to strengthen the foundation of our nation is to improve educational outcomes. According to the Richmond Fed, each additional high school graduate can result in lifetime public savings of over $200,000 relative to if that student had dropped out, when paired with the fact that over 2 million high school students dropped out in 2020. This suggests the U.S. lost over $400 billion in public savings due to our nation's high dropout rate in 2020 alone. In order to increase high school graduation rates and decrease long-term federal spending, we suggest that the U.S. government provides monthly conditional cash transfers of $300 to all 9th through 12th career students with passing grades. By implementing monthly CCPs, the U.S. can expect to decrease the dropout rate by 60%, resulting in $2.4 trillion in public savings over the next 3 years.
The 2023 Department of Defense budget is expected to reach $733 billion, and as of 2032 is expected to reach $966 billion. As the U.S. transitions out of the war on terror, prompted by the attacks of September 11, 2001, the spending of the Department of Defense should reflect the same. Thus, we propose a budget cut of $1.1 trillion over the next 10 years, indexing to inflation for the next 30 years. Although we looked into a deductive, an itemized deduction, we found that a budget reduction would be the most feasible because of programmatic and strategic uncertainty, as well as a reduced budget would allow and favor the use of U.S. diplomatic and economic actions to resolve the conflict. Overall, this would reduce the debt by $11.7 trillion over the next 30 years.
By investing in education, strengthening our workforce through immigration, and reevaluating the defense budget, we set the stage for an American economy that will flourish for future Americans, just like Washington. All Moines policies reduced the debt to GDP by 32 percentage points to 153%. If you direct your attention to the bottom of the screen, you will see our political feasibility metric. Each filled-in star indicates a level of support. We believe that educational reform will garner bipartisan support. However, we recognize that immigration and military are divisive topics. Nevertheless, we expect that these policies will generate moderate political support in the aggregate, given the net gains they provide for the economy.
Our opportunity section will provide a significant benefit to our nation's economic efficiency by embracing foregone opportunities. Through improving our infrastructure policies, we will have a more ambitious America.
The United States loses $87 billion each year due to traffic congestion. We propose investing in a high-speed rail within our urban centers as they would benefit the most from improved public transportation. Not only would this reduce congestion, but it also would improve economic output. According to a paper by two Chinese economists, cities that received an investment in high-speed rail saw a GDP boost by 3.3%. We expect our high-speed rail to cost $1 trillion over the next 10 years, but we plan to offset that with a fee-based mileage tax. Through these policies, we expect to increase the GDP by $6.6 trillion through improved productivity, and we increase the revenue by $1.4 trillion.
The United States currently has a severe housing shortage. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, monthly starts have fallen by 29% to 1.2 million. We proposed a supply, this housing shortage, in effect, costs the U.S. economy $2 trillion a year in lost productivity. We propose to offer a supply-side reform to end burdensome zoning regulations, such as single-family zoning and parking requirements, to address this shortfall. We would also mandate that 50% of new developments be zoned for multi-families. We recognize that many of these regulations are not enforced by state and federal governments, but in fact by local municipalities. And to work around this federalist issue, we will enact a policy in which low-income housing subsidies will be decreased for localities that do not comply with these new national standards. In effect, these policies will raise revenues by $6.3 trillion over the next 30 years.
As shown on this graph, the opportunity policies are expected to reduce our debt to GDP ratio by 22 percentage points in 2052. Through improving our infrastructure and housing, the U.S. will be able to more efficiently use its resources to invest in our future. Furthermore, when looking at the aggregate effect of the opportunity and warrants policy, we can see that they result in a new debt to GDP ratio of 131 percentage points in 2052. When considering the political feasibility of the opportunity policies, we expect moderate political support. This is due to the renewed interest in housing affordability in recent years and Democrats' desire to have a modernized transportation system.
Our reform section reevaluates some long-term American policies, like Medicare and Social Security, to reform these systems to better serve the American people.
Social Security is expected to be fully depleted by 2037. This shows our labor force simply cannot keep up with cannot keep meeting the needs of our retiring population. In order to offset this imbalance, we propose to raise the retirement age from 67 to 70 years old. In order to implement this policy more seamlessly, we propose to increase the age by 2 months for every year born after 1962, until reaching the new upper limit of 70 years old. That not only will this decrease our outlays, but it will also increase our worker-retiree ratio, promoting more balance for Social Security. Furthermore, we propose to subject earnings over $250,000 to payroll taxes. This will essentially create a donut in earnings between $162,000 and $250,000, ultimately leaving
5 minutes remaining.
which will eventually be close to inflation. These policies in aggregate will result in a 15 percentage point decrease in the debt to GDP ratio and over $15.3 trillion in public savings.
Employer-subsidized health insurance is one of the biggest tax subsidies in the U.S. tax code. Under current law, the employer's contributions to employees' health insurance is not taxed under income and payroll taxes. This costs the federal government $270 billion in uncollected revenue each year. To fix this, we propose taxing all contributions made in the 75th percentile, subjecting them to income and payroll taxes. We estimate that this proposal will generate over $4 trillion in revenue over the next 30 years.
Currently, there are over 60 million Americans relying on Medicare services. However, this figure is expected to increase as baby boomers over the next 2 decades will continue to retire. There will be further strain considering the fact that the current workers entering the labor market will not be enough to offset the number retiring. Thus, there's an enormous strain currently on Medicare. We propose to raise Medicare payroll taxes by 2% in order to create a Medicare system that is immune to demographic changes. This increased tax hike will net will decrease the debt ratio by 14 percentage points.
A chief aspect of nominal spending is inflation. Federal programs such as Social Security require cost of living adjustments in order to maintain the same support with fluctuation in pricing. Currently, the U.S. relies on the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index as an inflation measure for the cost of living. However, we propose that instead to use a chain CPI in order to best support those retirees and other. Additionally, this will lower government spending because chain CPI moves at 0.25 percentage points lower than regular CPI, and we believe that this will decrease our debt to GDP ratio by 3 percentage points by 2052.
The reform policies lead to an overall decrease of 36 percentage points in the debt to GDP ratio, resulting in a new 30-year projection of 95% in 2053 compared to our other policies. But by cutting spending and increasing taxes, we expect to appeal to both sides of the aisle. As Teddy Roosevelt once said, the nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation, increase and not impair in value. These policies will improve our natural and economic environment by acting against climate change and promoting clean energy.
A study at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago suggested that the negative impact of rising global temperatures could cost the U.S. roughly 0.7% GDP for every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature. Thus, we propose a $25 per metric ton tax on greenhouse gas emissions to incentivize businesses to invest in more environmentally friendly energy alternatives. Now, we are going to exclude gasoline from this tax to help low-income households not bear the negative burden of the tax. And this tax overall will decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 8% in 2032, and over the next 30 years, it will increase tax revenue by $2.1 trillion. If we don't invest in climate change soon, the effects to our environment and subsequently to our economy could be disastrous.
Deteriorating nuclear power plants are expected to cost the United States over $590 billion over the next 10 years if it wants to continue to meet its clean energy goals and Paris Accord expectations. In order to offset this, we propose to invest $242 billion to replace
1 minute
and
remaining.
renovate all 92 existing nuclear power plants so they can run for an additional 30 years. This will ultimately result in $1.1 trillion in public savings, and it will also help the United States preserve some energy independence.
The graph shows that the implementation of our environmentalism stage will result in an 8 percentage point decrease in the debt to GDP ratio, bringing our total down to 87% as of 2052. Now, we expect medium support for this environmentalism stage because although those on the right may be opposed to a carbon tax, we believe that maintaining the nuclear energy status quo will not deter many in Washington.
Through our series of targeted reforms and initiatives, the Rushmore Plan establishes financial austerity while ensuring positive economic growth for 2053 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and now it's time for our Q&A with the judges. Which judge would like to go first?
I'll start with what do you see as the biggest risk to your plan?
I think the biggest risk would be rising interest rates, as that will continue to increase the debt to GDP and put further fiscal strain on the United States. But we modeled out uncertainty. If you look at our graph to reflect that we don't know exactly what the future path of interest rates will be. So the upper bound of our policies fits for 98% debt to GDP ratio, reflecting higher interest rates, as we believe that's ultimately a significant risk to the U.S. economy given the Federal Reserve's recent action.
I would agree with what he said as well, because it seems that since a lot of our policies are things that we're going to have to pay for in the future, for example, education and stuff, it's more seems like an upfront cost before you start to see the benefits, that it's going to cost more to take on that debt necessarily now to pay for those things due to high interest rates.
Also, with these upper end estimates, we incorporate the GDP growing at a slower rate than economists anticipate, just to further model out a worst case scenario for the U.S. economy over the next 30 years.
Following up on the risks, did you consider, for example, in some of these programs that you're talking about, the potential economic downside, for example, the inflationary impact of providing the $300 per person, at the younger end, and the labor force participation effect of raising the payroll taxes. In other words, we've already got sort of a situation where there isn't as high participation in the labor force right now. Are you looking at the possibility that raising those taxes might further dampen participation in the labor force?
So I think, at least with respect to the education policy, the $300 a month per student is only enough to kind of cover food and basic expenses, so it's supposed to supplement kind of students have part-time jobs. So in the long run, it'll only cost about, if you pay one student $300 a month for 4 years of high school, it'll only cost about $14,400. And if that student does not graduate, it'll cost about $200,000. So we think that kind of the opportunity cost is upfront is better.
And if you look at the Medicare tax, we don't believe that raising it 2% will discourage labor force participation, as the labor supply is pretty inelastic in terms of hours worked, and people fundamentally still need to get an income, and we don't believe they're going to be discouraged by the 2% Medicare tax, and this will ultimately benefit them down the road, as it ensures that middle class and low income workers will have insurance funded health insurance when they retire.
Can I ask a clarification question on the Medicare 2% tax? Are you doing a new 2% tax on something? Are you increasing the Medicare payroll tax rate by 2% or 2 percentage points? What exactly is that tax?
It's increasing by 2 percentage points.
2%. Okay, so that 2% on the slide, so a 2% increase on 1.8 is not a lot. 2 percentage points gets to 3.8. So that's interesting. So I wanted to clarify. When thinking about the carbon tax, statutorily, who would pay it? So you've excluded gasoline, which I could see if you did gas, it'd be at the pump, you try to make sure low-income people aren't hit. What about utility bills? So who's the one who actually has to write the check to the IRS for the carbon tax? Is it, quote unquote, the oil industry? Is it going to be petroleum products? Am I going to see it on the consumer side when I go pay? Is it going to be, who actually makes the foot of payment? Who thought that was?
Our idea was to try to get the carbon tax so that it would be bigger businesses, so perhaps the oil or bigger companies that they're going to try to pay, so that for those companies they will try to invest in more clean energy goals. And so like while we recognize like the taxes, so like we're not going to keep getting as much as we anticipate because they're going to start investing away from it. That's kind of our goal. We don't really want to impact like the everyday American with this, especially since we have other sort of things like our rail system, like our high-speed rail that's trying to already incentivize people away from cars. Like we don't want to put even more burden on them.
But it's fine, I mean, it's kind of
Do you, but, okay, I have a question to follow up on the defense plan, defense spending. I mean, you talked about the global war on terror being largely resolved. I wanted to push back on the feasibility of that, or given current geopolitical issues, particularly with regard to Ukraine and Russia, competition with China. How much did you think about those issues where we're spending a considerable amount of defense funding to bolster democracies around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So since the war on terror, the Department of Defense has spent $8 trillion on the war on terror, and this budget reduction would be the lowest since the Korean War. So we believe that, yes, while geopolitical tensions in Russia are definitely a concern for the military, that this, especially since it's not itemized and that it's just a holistic blanket reduction, it will allow the military to allocate their funds as they see fit, especially in this current situation.
So I wanted to follow up a little bit on these conditional cash transfers to high school students. So you're paying every high school student $300 a month, right? Can you kind of break down, you know, that's going to have a fairly large cost. And I think the argument that you're making is that's going to incentivize so many people to stay in school that it's going to boost GDP so much that tax revenue more than covers. Can you break this down a little bit? What's the total cost? How many additional students will finish high school? And how does that translate? How much additional economic growth does that translate into?
Here, I'll pull up our slide. Yeah. So we expect like the way that we got the numbers, we expect there to be a 60% decrease in high school dropout rates, which will ultimately lead to like the $200,000 from the Fed. They suggested you'll have $200,000 in lifetime savings from high school students who graduate who originally were not expected to graduate, and this is due to things like that they're able to work more, like incentivize you to work in the workforce more. You're less likely to be reliant on social safety net programs, and like your chances of going to prison are lower statistically. And so basically, like that's how we got the number of like the decrease of the high school dropout rate by 60% from studies in UNICEF about Turkey, and then there were also a few studies in China which don't related this, and that was like kind of the payout of like that kind of policy. And so we expect that because you're going to be spending less on social safety net programs, and because you're going to have a boosted labor force, more productivity, in addition to the human capital benefits, which are really not quantifiable, that we're going to have like that is going to have a payout.
Can you spend a little more time talking about high-speed rail, especially given California's recent examples of not being able to do it well, high costs over budget? Do you think you can do something like this with high-speed rail on a national scale? I know you're doing it in metropolitan areas, but kind of do it within budget, within time, to get the benefits that you're going to get from productivity?
Yeah, absolutely. When we first examined high-speed rail, we thought we wanted to do a national program, but then we realized that for a lot of the reasons why California failed, that wasn't going to be feasible, and that investing in these metropolitan and urban centers, improving their public transportation, would provide a higher return on investment. If you really read through some of the accounts of why California's high-speed rail hasn't gotten off to a great start, or why there's been blazing over budget, it's for two primary reasons. The first is that they redirected the route to go around more remote communities, and that increased the cost. It was originally supposed to be a much more straight shot through the entire state. And then the second reason why they've been overcost is the fact that they started the project in the middle of the rail system instead of starting it at the end and meeting each other in the middle. And so to work around that, we're only going to invest in the urban communities, so we don't have to go out in remote areas, and we're going to start by working at both ends of the rail instead of doing that in the middle. So California's really taught us a lot about what not to do when it comes to implementing this policy, and that's what we plan to do for high-speed rail.
5 minutes remaining.
Following up on that, talking a little bit more about transportation lawmakers love transportation projects, in part because they can, bring them to their districts. But if you concentrate high-speed rail only in urban areas, do you think you could garner enough support to get that type of a program through Congress?
I think so, largely because considering like after COVID, so many people moved out of communities like San Francisco and moved to, remote, probably 45 minutes outside of cities, New York, and now we're seeing that shifting migrants were going back into the office, but now a huge number of Americans have now, moved their residencies outside these cities. And so I think commuting-wise into these central urban areas is where it's actually going to be most effective, as opposed to more of these remote aspects of the rail system, which not that many people use. By doing the urban areas, where I think we're getting a targeted reform that really impacts the most amount of people.
And if you look at the electorate, these urban centers have vast amounts of the United States population, thus have a lot of representation in Congress. So we do think that there would be a lot of push to get this done and to increase the well-being of those voters in those districts.
I want to ask something about your Social Security plan. So you said you were going to switch to indexing benefits using the chained CPI, and I think you make a good point. That's a better, more accurate measure of inflation. The pushback that you're going to get from organizations like AARP is that older people tend to spend more of their income on healthcare, which historically has grown. The cost of healthcare has grown faster than inflation. And so you're actually going to be less accurately representing the cost of living increases that the older population faces, and especially you're going to be cutting benefits for the oldest people who are potentially most vulnerable. Do you have? I was wondering how you might respond to that criticism from.
I would say that mainly what we're doing is that, yes, like definitely there's going to be huge pushback from organizations like ARP who rely on these benefits, but we also made that consideration when we expanded Medicare, that, a huge aspect is keeping Medicare solvent, or else for senior situations it would be dire 30 years down the line when they may not have access to it. And I think largely, there's several aspects to reforming to Social Security. One of them is possibly, cutting great benefits entirely, and we wanted to ensure that the people that paid into the system throughout their lives received the support they were promised. And so that is why, that's kind of why we made sure that, yes, we do, we're going to cut cost of living adjustments, but we're also making sure that we reform Social Security in a way that will not inflict too much harm on senior citizens.
This kind of raises a good, probably near wrap-up question for you. I know you have a package. This is a package. But when you present this, what one policy do you think you'd have the best chance of getting passed? And what is the one policy that would be the hardest challenge to get passed?
I think that one policy that would probably garner a lot of support, especially in like today's world, would be like our nuclear policy. Because I think if you look at places like France and stuff, you can see that they're regretting kind of shifting away from having their nuclear power plants still kind of in place. Not only that, we're not like expanding on anything, we're kind of maintaining the status quo of what we've been having in the United States. So I feel like that would be a policy that would hopefully garner a lot of support on both sides of the aisle.
1 minute remaining.
And the hardest one?
I think that would probably have to be the 2% Medicare tax, as people don't necessarily like the fact that their income would be taxed more. But if you really pitch it to citizens that this is going to benefit them down the road, ensuring that their Medicare is going to be well funded and it's not going to be insolvent, as we feel many talking heads and politicians say, then that should garner enough support to get it passed through Congress. But we do recognize that most people don't like it when their income is taxable.
All right, well, thank you for your fine work. You're permitted to sit in the audience now if you'd like.
Good job.